Imagine for a second that you're trying to run a really complex piece of software. Let's just call it Western civilization.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right, but you are running it on an operating system that hasn't seen an update since the Middle Ages. The interface is glitchy. The rules for how everything works are basically hidden in a locked file.
And only one guy has the password.
Exactly. Usually a guy wearing a crown.
Right, and if you try to open the terminal to see the code yourself, or even just ask why the system keeps crashing all the time, you don't just get an error message.
No, you get thrown in a dungeon or burned at the stake.
Yeah, it was a high-stakes environment.
It really was, and that was the human condition for centuries. You could say the world ran on version 1.0, which was basically just, because I said so.
Because I said so. That's good.
Why is the king in charge? Because God said so. Why does the sun move across the sky that way? Because the church said so. Why are you a peasant shoveling mud for your entire life?
Tradition.
Tradition. But then we get this massive patch update. It starts downloading in the late 1600s, and by the end of the 1700s, the whole system is completely rebooted.
We switch from because I said so to let's figure it out.
Let's figure it out. I love that. Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Today we are unpacking the source code of our own society. We're looking at a specific shift in thinking that gave us modern democracy, science, human rights.
But we are also going to look at the bugs in that new code, the contradictions, the massive blind spots.
Because it is a messy story. We're talking about the Age of Enlightenment.
And it really isn't just a boring chapter in a history book. It is effectively the invention of the modern mind. It's full of arguments, lots of coffee, literal revolutions, and frankly, some very hypocritical people who also happen to be absolute geniuses.
So before we get into the heavy hitters, your Newtons and your Voltaires, we need a mission statement for this era. There is this Latin phrase that keeps popping up in all the source material, sapere aude.
Yeah, sapere aude. That actually comes from the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. In 1784, he wrote a pretty famous essay answering a simple prompt, what is enlightenment?
And his answer was that motto.
Exactly. It translates to dare to know.
Dare to know. It sounds, I don't know, almost aggressive, like a dare you'd get on a playground.
Well, it was meant to be a challenge to you. Kant defined enlightenment as humanity's release from its self-incurred tutelage.
Tutelage meaning?
Meaning needing a babysitter, being unable to use your own understanding without getting direction from someone else, like a priest or a king or just an ancient text.
So he's essentially calling out humanity for being intellectually lazy.
He is. He's saying that ignorance isn't just a lack of books or resources, it's a lack of courage. He's telling people to stop waiting for permission to understand the world.
That requires a huge amount of confidence, though. I mean, to stand up to 1,000 years of established tradition and say, actually, I think you're all wrong. Where did that kind of confidence even come from?
It definitely didn't just appear out of thin air. It was built on a foundation that had just been laid by the scientific revolution. You really can't have the political enlightenment without the scientific one that came right before it.
Because the scientists proved it was possible.
Exactly. The scientists basically handed the philosophers a loaded weapon, which was the scientific method.
And this is where we have to talk about Isaac Newton, the Apple guy.
The Apple guy, yes. Though, to be fair, the apple is probably the least interesting part of his story. We really need to talk about his book, The Principia Mathematica, published in 1687.
Which is arguably the most important book in the history of science.
Easily.
So what did he actually prove in there that changed the vibe of Europe so drastically?
Well, before Newton, the universe was seen as this deeply mystical place. Things happened because of spiritual forces or divine intervention. Maybe an angel was literally pushing the planets across the sky.
Or maybe the king ruled because his blood was somehow magic.
Right. But Newton comes along and proves, using incredibly rigorous mathematics, that the universe follows laws. Universal gravitation, the laws of motion.
So if I drop a pen in London and I drop a pen in Paris, they fall at the exact same rate.
And it's calculable down to the decimal point. He showed that nature isn't chaotic or whimsical. It's a machine. It's a clockwork universe. And crucially, the human mind is actually capable of understanding the gears of that machine.
You don't need a priest to interpret gravity for you. You just need calculus.
Exactly.
Okay, so Newton proves nature makes sense. But how does the culture make that massive leap from gravity works to, we should overthrow the king?
That's what historians call the spillover effect. Think about the mindset of a philosopher sitting in a room in, say, 1700. You look up at the night sky and you see this perfect rational order. Everything moves according to a brilliant mathematical plan.
Right.
But then you look out your window at human society and it's a total mess.
Yeah, it's endless wars, famine, arbitrary torture, completely incompetent leaders, religious persecution.
So the obvious logical question becomes, if God, or nature, created this perfectly rational universe, why is our society so profoundly irrational?
Oh, wow. So they start thinking, if there are laws of gravity, surely there must be laws of politics.
Precisely. Laws of economics, laws of human nature. It kicked off this massive search for the science of man. They wanted to debug human society the exact same way Newton debugged the solar system.
But to do that kind of science, you need a totally new way of thinking. You can't just fall back on quoting the Bible or Aristotle anymore.
No, you can't.
And this brings us to René Descartes.
Yes. Descartes is basically the hard reset button for philosophy. He's a bit earlier than the other guys we're talking about, but he sets the rules of the game for the Enlightenment. He famously decided to sit down and just doubt everything that could possibly be doubted.
The ultimate skeptic.
Truly. He doubted his own senses, he doubted all traditions, he even doubted whether he was awake or just dreaming the whole thing. He systematically stripped everything away until he hit bedrock, the one single thing he could not logically doubt.
Cogito, ergo sum.
I think, therefore I am.
Which, we see on T-shirts and coffee mugs today. But let's actually look at the implication for a second. He is centering the entire universe on the individual thinker.
That is the absolute key to this whole era. Notice what he didn't say. He didn't say, the church teaches, therefore I am.
Right.
He made the individual conscious mind the final judge of what is true. That is a massive shift in authority. It says that truth is internal to you. It's not something externally handed down by a bishop.
Okay, so we have Newton saying the universe has discoverable laws and Descartes saying my own mind has the power to figure them out.
Yes.
Now we just need to figure out what a human being actually is in this new system. And for that, we turn to the English philosopher John Locke.
John Locke is the crucial bridge between the scientific revolution and the political revolutions. In his essay concerning human understanding, he drops this absolute bombshell of a concept, tabula rasa.
The blank slate.
The blank slate. For centuries, the prevailing view, heavily reinforced by the church and the aristocracy, was that you were born with innate ideas.
Meaning you were born with original sin.
Right, or if you were a noble, you were literally born with blue blood. An inherent biological superiority to everyone else. You are your hardware, basically.
You were pre-programmed from birth.
Locke argued absolutely not. He said the mind at birth is like white paper, void of all characters. Everything we know, everything we are, comes purely from our lived experience and sensation.
Now, that sounds like a really nice progressive psychological theory today. But politically, back then, that is dynamite. Because if I am born a blank slate, and the king is born a blank slate.
And the king isn't inherently better than you. He's just had better tutors. He's had better inputs written onto his slate.
And if you gave a peasant from the mud the exact same tutors,
you would get the exact same result. It implies that human nature is completely malleable. You can improve people by improving their environment and their education.
Which completely destroys the justification for hereditary privilege.
It obliterates it. It replaces the idea of bloodlines with the idea of universal education and social reform.
So society suddenly becomes this construction project. You don't just accept your lot in life, you actively build a better society. But I want to be careful here because was everyone actually on board with this tear it all down energy?
Definitely not. And this is a nuance we often miss when we talk about this period. Historians distinguish between two distinct wings of the movement. You had the moderate Enlightenment and the radical Enlightenment.
What's the core difference between the two?
The moderates, these are guys like Locke, Voltaire, even Newton himself. They wanted to fix the roof of the house. They wanted to compromise with the existing power structure.
They wanted to find a balance between reason and faith.
Exactly. They were generally okay with having a king as long as he wasn't a tyrant and listened to good advice. They wanted careful reform, not a bloody revolution.
And the radicals?
The radicals looked at the house and said, this is rotten to the studs. Let's burn it down and build a new one. Thinkers like Baruch Spinoza.
Spinoza is a fascinating guy. He essentially got canceled centuries before canceling was a thing.
He really did. He was excommunicated from the Jewish community in Amsterdam when he was only in his 20s. He argued that God and nature were the exact same thing. Deus sive natura.
And to the religious authorities of the time, that sounded dangerously close to atheism.
Because it was. If God is just the physical laws of nature, then God isn't up in the clouds writing holy books or choosing which kings get to sit on thrones.
So the radicals were taking that to its logical conclusion.
They were saying, no kings whatsoever, no state-sponsored church, full representative democracy, total freedom of expression. These were ideas that wouldn't actually become mainstream for another 200 years.
So you have this intense tension running through the whole era. The careful reformers versus the revolutionaries.
And honestly, that tension never really goes away. It's the core tension of modern politics. Evolution versus revolution.
Okay, so we have the ideas, we have the philosophy, but ideas are totally useless if they just stay locked in one guy's head in Amsterdam.
Yeah.
They need to travel.
Right.
Today, you have social media, you have deep dives like this one. What did they have? How did a complex philosophical idea go viral in 1750?
They had something called the Republic of Letters.
Which sounds incredibly dignified and polite.
It was a self-proclaimed virtual community of scholars and intellectuals that completely transcended national borders. You had people in Paris, London, Berlin, Philadelphia, all fiercely writing letters to each other.
A giant group chat.
Basically. And it didn't matter if you were a wealthy lord or a working-class printer. In the Republic of Letters, the only currency that mattered was the quality of your argument. If you could write a brilliant, persuasive letter, you were in the club.
And the ultimate server for this network, essentially the Wikipedia of the 18th century, was the encyclopedia.
The encyclopedia. It is really hard to overstate just how important this project was. It was edited by Denis Diderot and Jean d'Alembert. It took them more than 20 years to complete this massive set of books.
Now, when I hear the word encyclopedia, I think of a dusty, neutral collection of dry facts. But this was actually highly opinionated, wasn't it?
It was a Trojan horse. Diderot literally wrote that the goal of the project was to change the common way of thinking.
How do you do that with a reference book, though?
By how you choose to organize the information. In medieval worldview, all human knowledge started with God. Theology was known as the queen of the sciences. It sat at the very top of the intellectual pyramid.
Right.
Diderot completely threw that out. He created a tree of knowledge based entirely on the human mind. He divided it into memory, reason, and imagination.
So where did he put religion in that new tree?
He severely demoted it. He made theology just a tiny sub-branch of philosophy. And, very cheekily, on the visual diagram of the tree, the science of God is located suspiciously close to branches like black magic and superstition.
That is some high-level shade right there. That's a brilliant Easter egg for the intellectuals reading it.
It was incredibly subversive for the time, but it also democratized knowledge by elevating what they called the mechanical arts. It had these beautiful, detailed diagrams on how to make glass, how to weave silk, how to mine coal.
Elevating the working class.
Yes. It made the bold statement that the physical labor of a tradesman was just as rational and dignified as the abstract work of a theologian.
And people actually bought these massive sets of books.
They absolutely devoured them. Despite being officially banned by the King of France and the Pope Diderot was constantly terrified and hiding his manuscripts from the Parisian police, there were about 25,000 complete sets in circulation by 1789.
Wow.
It created a shared baseline database of secular knowledge for the entire educated class of Europe.
But you can't just read books alone in your room. You need to talk about them. You need to debate. Where was this happening physically? Because you can't just stand on a street corner in Paris and shout about Spinoza without getting arrested.
If you were in England, you went to the coffee house.
Ah, the penny universities.
Exactly. For the price of one single penny, you got a cup of coffee, which was a brand new, highly exotic stimulant at the time, and you got admission to the conversation.
The caffeine element has to be important here, right? Because before this, people were basically drinking weak beer and wine all day just because the water wasn't safe to drink.
It absolutely matters. You are taking an entire population and switching them from a depressant, alcohol, to a potent stimulant. The coffee house was this space of intense, wired, hyper-focused energy, and crucially, it was socially mixed.
The sources describe it as a Noah's Ark.
Yes. You would walk into a coffee house in London and see a wealthy merchant fiercely arguing trade tariffs with a broke poet. You'd see a brilliant scientist debating a local lawyer.
So your social class didn't dictate your voice.
The normal, rigid social hierarchy was temporarily suspended at the door. Historians point to the coffee house as the literal birth of public opinion as a political force.
Now, if you look across the English Channel in France, the vibe was very different. Less noisy, caffeinated coffee shop and more exclusive high-end dinner party.
The salons, and this is a really crucial point, the salons were almost entirely the domain of women, the salonières.
We're talking about incredibly influential women like Madame Geoffrin or Julie de Lespinasse.
Right. In a society where women were completely barred from attending universities or holding formal political office, the salon was a private space where they wielded immense intellectual power.
They weren't just hostesses passing out snacks.
Not at all. They were the executive moderators. They set the entire agenda for the evening. They carefully curated the guest list. They decided who was currently in and who was out.
So they were essentially the gatekeepers of the French Enlightenment.
They civilized the conversation. They brought these rough, sometimes socially awkward, radical philosophers into the exact same room as the highest aristocracy. They made these dangerous, subversive ideas fashionable.
If you couldn't hold your own in a Parisian salon, you just weren't going to make it as a serious thinker.
Exactly. You'd be ignored.
There is one more physical space I really want to hit because it feels like it belongs straight in a spy movie.
Yeah.
The Freemasons.
The Masonic lodges. It is so easy to get completely lost in the conspiracy theories with them, but the actual historical reality is fascinating enough on its own. These were secret societies, yes, but their main secret was mostly just that they were practicing democracy behind closed doors.
How so? What were they actually doing in there?
Inside the lodge, all brothers were considered strictly equal, regardless of their outside social rank. They wrote formal constitutions for their individual lodges. They held binding elections for their leaders. They debated internal policy using parliamentary rules.
So it was a simulator.
A simulator is a great word for it.
You go to the lodge on Tuesday night, you practice voting and debating as an equal, and then you go back out into the absolute monarchy on Wednesday morning, and you can't help but think, hey, why can't we do this out here in the real world?
Exactly. It was a safe laboratory for constitutional government. And just look at the membership roster. You have Montesquieu, Voltaire, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, Mozart.
That's a wild dinner party.
It was a massive transatlantic network of influential people quietly committed to the ideals of liberty, fraternity, and equality.
So we've built the foundation. We have the scientific method, the new psychology of the blank slate, the encyclopedia, and the underground meeting spots. Now let's talk about the main event. Politics.
Because this is where the rubber finally meets the road.
Or where the blade meets the neck, in some cases. This is the massive shift from the divine right of kings to the social contract. Let's break that down for you. Divine right is simple. God chose the king. Deal with it. What exactly is the social contract?
It's the radical idea that government is fundamentally a deal, a contract between two parties. We, the people, willingly agree to give up a small portion of our absolute natural freedom to a central government. And in exchange, that government is obligated to protect our core interests.
What happens if the government breaks their end of the contract?
Well, that highly depends on which philosopher you ask. John Locke was very clear. He said that the government's only legitimate job is to protect your natural rights, which he defined as life, liberty, and property.
Okay.
If the government fails to protect those, or actively attacks them, the people don't just have the right to revolt, they have the moral duty to revolt and set up a new government.
Which Thomas Jefferson basically copy-pasted directly into the American Declaration of Independence.
Almost word for word, yes. But then you have Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He is the wild card of this era.
Rousseau is the guy who famously said, man is born free and everywhere he is in chains.
Right. Rousseau was different because he actually thought that civilization itself was the main problem. He deeply romanticized what he called the state of nature before society corrupted us. For him, the social contract wasn't just about protecting your private property. It was about aligning society with the general will.
The general will. That sounds a bit slippery.
It is incredibly slippery. It's this abstract idea of the collective good of the people. But the dangerous question is, who actually gets to decide what the collective good is? Maximilien Robespierre and the radical Jacobins directly used Rousseau's ideas to justify the reign of terror during the French Revolution. They claimed they were chopping off thousands of heads purely in service of the general will.
So Locke's theories lead directly to American liberal democracy, and Rousseau's theories sort of lead to radical populism and state violence.
That is definitely a simplification, but it's not entirely wrong. You can trace those lineages. Then you have Montesquieu, who is much more of a pragmatic engineer. He looks at human nature and says, look, anyone who is given power will eventually abuse it. It's inevitable.
Power corrupts.
Exactly. So his solution is, don't rely on the king just being a nice, virtuous guy. Rely on a mechanical structure. The separation of powers. You chop the power of the state up into competing pieces: executive, legislative, and judicial.
Like a game of rock, paper, scissors.
Checks and balances. It is a purely mechanical, systemic solution to a fundamental human flaw.
Now here is the plot twist that I find just bizarre about this entire era. You have these brilliant philosophers writing these fiery, brilliant critiques of tyranny and absolute power. And they turn out to be some of their biggest fans and sponsors, the tyrants themselves.
The enlightened despots. It is truly the great paradox of the 18th century.
We're talking about absolute monarchs like Frederick the Great of Prussia or Catherine the Great of Russia.
Frederick is the perfect example of this paradox. He was, for all intents and purposes, a ruthless military dictator. But he genuinely saw himself as a philosopher. He played the flute beautifully, he composed music, he wrote French poetry, he even invited Voltaire to come live at his royal palace.
Come live in my lavish castle. Write books criticizing the concept of kings, all while I remain the absolute king with a massive army.
Yes, Frederick proudly called himself the first servant of the state. He fundamentally believed in rational, efficient rule. He reformed the legal codes, he promoted religious tolerance, and he heavily funded the sciences. But his core motto to his subjects was, argue as much as you like about whatever you like, but obey.
He wanted all the efficiency and scientific progress of the Enlightenment without any of the messy political freedom.
Exactly. He wanted a completely modern, streamlined, powerful state machinery, but he certainly wasn't going to let the peasants vote on how to run it.
And Catherine the Great, I know she was actively exchanging letters with Diderot.
She was a massive patron of the Enlightenment. She actually bailed Diderot out when he was completely broke. She bought his entire personal library, left it in his house, and then paid him an annual salary just to act as its librarian.
That's amazing.
She also drafted a massive new legal code for Russia called the Nakaz, which was heavily plagiarized from Montesquieu's writings.
But there's a but here.
But she ruled the Russian Empire. And the Russian Empire ran entirely on the brutal system of serfdom. Catherine was smart enough to know that her grip on power rested entirely on keeping the nobility happy. So while she enthusiastically talked about human liberty in French to her intellectual pen pals, in Russian, she actually passed harsh laws that tightened the chains of serfdom on millions of people.
So for her, it was mostly a branding exercise.
Yeah.
High-level PR.
It was intellectual window dressing. But then you have Emperor Joseph II of Austria. He's the one who definitely wasn't faking it.
The tragic hero of the story.
Joseph II was a true radical believer in these ideas. The moment he became sole emperor, he went full throttle. He totally abolished serfdom. He aggressively shut down hundreds of monasteries that weren't actively running schools or hospitals because he thought they were useless.
Wow.
He declared total religious equality across his empire, even for Jewish citizens, which was practically unheard of at the time.
So he essentially tried to force the Enlightenment onto his people from the top down.
And he completely crashed the car. The powerful nobles absolutely hated him because he freed their forced labor. The Catholic Church hated him for taking their land, and ironically, even the peasants revolted against him because his rapid-fire reforms moved way too fast and completely disrupted their traditional daily way of life.
That is the ultimate irony, isn't it? He failed precisely because he didn't secure the consent of the governed, even though he was genuinely trying to liberate them.
He pushed too hard, too fast. He died a deeply broken, exhausted man. He actually asked for his own tombstone epitaph to read, "Here lies Joseph II, who failed in all he undertook."
That is just brutal. But it teaches a vital lesson about this philosophy. You cannot violently impose freedom from a throne.
No, you can't. Authentic liberty has to grow organically from the bottom up.
Speaking of things growing or failing to grow, we absolutely have to talk about the massive blind spot of this era, the giant elephant in the room that we haven't touched on yet.
Slavery.
How do you sit at a desk and write, "All men are created equal," while literally owning other human beings?
It is the defining, unforgivable hypocrisy of the Enlightenment. The exploding economies of Britain, France, and the American colonies were entirely fueled by the brutality of the Atlantic slave trade. And many of these supposedly enlightened philosophers were deeply complicit. John Locke himself literally invested money in the Royal African Company, which traded in enslaved people.
How did they conceptually justify that to themselves? Did they just conveniently not see the contradiction?
No, they saw it. But they heavily compartmentalized. They actually used the brand new tools of scientific classification to arbitrarily categorize humanity into a hierarchy, creating what we now call scientific racism. They falsely argued that Africans were somehow less rational and therefore naturally less capable of handling liberty.
Right.
It was a horrific intellectual gymnastics routine, a way to preach the beautiful philosophy of freedom while keeping all the massive economic profits of oppression.
But the ideas themselves, the actual concepts of universal liberty, they didn't stay in the neat little box the Europeans tried to keep them in.
No, they absolutely did not. And this leads to perhaps the most powerful, dramatic story of the entire era, the Haitian Revolution.
Toussaint Louverture.
Yes. Toussaint was born an enslaved man in the brutally profitable French sugar colony of Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti. But he was literate, and he managed to read the radical works of the French Enlightenment. Specifically, he read a history book by the Abbé Raynal that fiercely condemned colonialism and explicitly predicted that a black Spartacus would soon rise up to avenge the crimes of the New World.
So Toussaint reads this European philosopher's book and thinks, I'm the guy.
Exactly. He effectively weaponized the Enlightenment directly against the Enlighteners. He organized and led a massive revolution that wasn't just about gaining national independence, it was about forcing the universal application of human rights.
He called their bluff. And they won.
They won against all odds. In 1794, the revolutionary French Republic, under immense pressure from the victorious Haitian rebels, was legally forced to abolish slavery entirely. It was the enslaved people of Haiti, not the wealthy men in Parisian salons, who actually forced the Enlightenment to live up to its own universal promises.
It really just goes to show that once you let a potent idea like human liberty out into the world, you can no longer control who uses it.
You can't. It fundamentally belongs to everyone who claims it.
We focused a ton on Europe and the Atlantic, but this was a truly global moment. I mean, we obviously have Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson in America bridging that gap.
Franklin is such an interesting figure because he perfectly embodies the practical, pragmatic side of the Enlightenment. He isn't sitting around writing dense, high-level metaphysical theory. He's out there inventing bifocal glasses and lightning rods. He's organizing the first public fire departments and lending libraries.
He represents the very American idea that knowledge should be immediately useful to everyday life.
Exactly. Applied reason.
But what about outside the Western sphere entirely? Was the rest of the globe just sitting around in the dark while Europe read encyclopedias?
Not at all. In fact, the European thinkers themselves were absolutely obsessed with Asia, particularly China. Voltaire, for instance, deeply admired the Chinese system.
Why China specifically?
Because he saw the Qing dynasty as the ultimate rational meritocracy. Think about it. In France, you became a powerful government minister simply because your dad happened to be a duke.
Right.
But in China, you became a powerful state official by rigorously studying and passing the incredibly difficult imperial civil service exam. You had to master Confucian classics and administrative law. Voltaire looked at that and thought it was the absolute height of political reason.
So he was basically using an idealized version of China as a stick to beat the corrupt French system with.
Exactly. He was saying, look over there. They are running a massive empire based on educated merit. Why can't we? It was definitely a bit of a European projection, but it shows they were looking globally for models of good governance. And later on, you see these Western ideas reflecting back outwards. In the late 19th century, Japan launches the massive Meiji Restoration, and their literal translation for their guiding slogan was civilization and enlightenment.
Wow.
They actively adopted Western scientific methods and rational statecraft to rapidly modernize their own country so they wouldn't be colonized.
So here we are today. We've covered the birth of the scientific method, the secret democratic societies, the bloody revolutions, and the actual invention of universal human rights.
No.
When we take a massive step back, what is the core legacy here? What did this era actually do to our daily reality?
Fundamentally, it changed the operating system of humanity. It definitively moved the ultimate source of legitimacy and truth from the sky down to the earth, from the arbitrary will of God to the rational consent of the people.
And it changed how we actually process information, right? The reading revolution.
Yes, the reading revolution is key. Before the Enlightenment, if you were lucky enough to be literate, you maybe owned a Bible and an almanac. And you read them intensively, meaning you read the exact same text over and over again, memorizing every word, looking for hidden divine truth.
Okay.
But during the Enlightenment, with the absolute explosion of the printing press, people started reading extensively. They devoured cheap novels, daily newspapers, political pamphlets. You read a text once, you rapidly absorbed the new information, synthesized it, and moved right on to the next one.
That sounds exactly like us today. Except instead of pamphlets, it's endless tweets and news headlines.
It is the literal birth of the modern rapid-fire information consumer.
Which brings us all the way back to the beginning. Saper. Dare to know.
That was the defining challenge back then. The main problem in 1750 was that good information was incredibly scarce and irrational authority was incredibly strong. You had to be genuinely brave just to find the truth.
And today, for the listener right now.
Today, we have the exact opposite problem. Information is infinite. It's overwhelming. And authority is completely fractured. But I would argue the challenge of Kant's motto remains exactly the same. Do we actually have the courage to slow down and use our own critical reason? Or do we just lazily let social media, algorithms, and comfortable echo chambers do all the thinking for us?
Are we still daring to be enlightened? Or are we just mindlessly scrolling?
That is the ultimate question for us today, because the Enlightenment isn't just a static historical event that ended in 1789. It is an ongoing, active process, and it's a process that you have to consciously choose to participate in every single day.
I think that is the perfect, provocative place to leave it. Dare to know, everyone. Dig into the code.
And keep thinking for yourself.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We will see you next time. Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're looking at a subject today that permanently altered the trajectory of modern conflict.
It really did.
Yeah, it's a moment in history where that rigid boundary between the digital domain and the physical world effectively just dissolved.
Right, completely vanished.
We are talking about a sophisticated piece of code that crossed the air gap to weaponize heavy industrial machinery. Our sole source for this analysis today is a really comprehensive Wikipedia article. It details the history, the mechanical execution, and the geopolitical fallout of the malware known as Stuxnet.
Which is a name that carries a lot of weight.
Oh, absolutely. If you follow cybersecurity at all, you already know the name. But today, we are going beyond the headlines to really dissect the architecture of the attack.
Digging into the actual mechanics of it.
Exactly. We're going to look at how it propagated, how it targeted specific hardware signatures, and how its discovery triggered a global cyber arms race that, honestly, we are still dealing with today.
It is a fundamental paradigm shift in threat modeling. Well, Stuxnet wasn't merely a sophisticated worm. It was the first widely documented cyber weapon to cause actual physical destruction of critical infrastructure.
Physical destruction, not just deleting files.
Right. Before this, the prevailing threat models for industrial control systems focused largely on broad disruptions or, data exfiltration, just stealing information.
Yeah.
But the revelation of this code forced a global reevaluation of how we secure the invisible digital frameworks that control our power grids, our water treatment plants, and our manufacturing sectors.
Because suddenly the stakes were physical. So the mission for our deep dive today is to map that exact shift. We want to understand the mechanical reality of how a massive compiled file on a little USB drive navigated a highly secured environment to execute a targeted physical strike.
A very precise strike.
We're going to trace the forensic breadcrumbs from the initial discovery of the anomalous code all the way down to the resonant frequencies of the sabotaged hardware. Okay, let's unpack this.
To appreciate the technical audacity of the code, we really have to look at the landscape of threat intelligence back in the summer of 2010.
Right, take us back there. What were researchers dealing with mostly?
Well, security researchers were accustomed to analyzing malware designed for financial gain or botnet proliferation.
Or just espionage, right?
Exactly. And that code was usually lightweight. It was optimized for rapid transmission over networks and designed to exploit widely known vulnerabilities just to get maximum infection volume.
Just spreading as fast as possible.
Yeah. But then, in June 2010, this Belarusian antivirus company, Virus Blockada, they received reports from clients in Iran about computers caught in reboot loops.
Just constantly crashing and restarting.
Right. So a researcher there named Sergei Ulesin began analyzing the offending file. And the telemetry immediately indicated this was not a standard threat actor.
And the initial propagation vector itself was notable, right? Because it heavily relied on local physical transmission.
It did.
It wasn't primarily blasting itself across the internet via malicious email attachments or compromised web servers like we usually see. It was utilizing removable drives.
USBs.
Yeah, USB flash drives. The malware would infect a host machine and then aggressively replicate itself onto any inserted USB drive. It created this physical contagion model designed specifically to bypass network perimeter defenses.
Which is brilliant if you think about it.
But it was the sheer size and structure of the file that completely bewildered early analysts. The source notes the file was roughly 0.5 megabyte.
Which sounds tiny to us today.
Right, but in the context of malware development.
Oh, it's huge. Operators pride themselves on microscopic payloads measured in mere kilobytes. A 0.5 megabyte binary is a behemoth.
It's massive.
It suggested a really massive compiled program carrying extensive internal libraries and complex logic trees.
And it wasn't just written in one language either. It was written in multiple programming languages, including C and C++ when it.
What's fascinating here is the implication of that development environment. A multi-language, 0.5 megabyte compiled binary points away from like a lone wolf operator, or even a small cybercriminal syndicate.
It looks corporate.
Exactly. It points toward a formalized software development lifecycle. It suggests distinct teams working on different modules.
Like a propagation team.
Right. A team handling payload delivery, a team writing the rootkit, and then all their work was integrated into a single massive payload.
But the size was merely the first anomaly, wasn't it?
Yeah, the forensic analysis truly escalated when researchers realized how the worm was achieving remote code execution.
Because it was burning an unprecedented amount of zero-day exploits.
4 of them.
Yeah, 4. For you listening who might be familiar with the vulnerability market, you know the deployment of even a single zero-day is a huge deal.
A massive event.
Because a zero-day is an exploit for a software vulnerability that is completely unknown to the vendor. It's unpatched. 0 days are the ultimate premium asset in cyber espionage.
They are incredibly expensive to discover, engineer, and weaponize.
Right, often selling for hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars on the exploit market. Standard advanced persistent threat groups might use 1 0-day to breach a high-value target. But according to our source, Stuxnet deployed 4 separate 0-day vulnerabilities simultaneously.
Which is wild. Deploying 4 0 days in a single payload is the digital equivalent of burning millions of dollars in black market research and development in a single strike.
Just lighting the money on fire.
Pretty much. Because the moment those exploits are used in the wild, the clock starts ticking. Security firms will capture the code, vendors will issue patches, and the exploits will become completely worthless.
So to willingly burn 4 at once signals an attacker with virtually unlimited resources.
Right, aiming at a target of such extreme strategic value that the loss of the exploits is considered an acceptable operational cost.
Let's examine the specific vulnerabilities it leveraged, because the technical implementation was devastatingly effective.
It really was.
It utilized a vulnerability in the Windows print spooler service for local network propagation. But the most aggressive vector was the LNK, or PIF, Windows Explorer exploit, designated as CVE 2010-2568.
And this wasn't a vulnerability that required a user to run an executable.
Right.
Or open a macro-laced document.
No, the vulnerability existed in how the Windows operating system parsed the metadata of shortcut files.
The tactical advantage of that LNK exploit cannot be overstated, especially for an air-gapped environment.
Explain that a bit more for the listener.
Sure. So in a typical scenario, an operator might plug a USB drive into an engineering workstation. Merely opening the folder to view the contents forces Windows Explorer to render the icons for the files.
Just to show what's in the folder.
Exactly. But the malicious LNK file was engineered so that the mere act of rendering its icon executed the malware payload in the background.
Wow.
It was essentially a zero-click execution. The human operator didn't have to make a mistake. They didn't have to click a bad link, they just had to look at the contents of the drive.
That is terrifying.
The malware also leveraged vulnerabilities previously associated with the configure worm, which ensured broad compatibility across unpatched legacy systems.
And beyond the exploits, the attackers needed to ensure the malware could install its drivers deep within the Windows operating system without triggering user account control warnings or alerting endpoint security software.
Right, it had to be invisible.
To achieve this, they compromised the public key infrastructure itself. The source details that the malicious rootkit drivers were digitally signed with legitimate, stolen private keys from 2 highly reputable hardware manufacturers, J-Micron and Realtek.
And both of those companies were located in a specific science park in Taiwan.
Right.
The compromise of those digital certificates is a critical element of the tradecraft. The Windows operating system relies on certificate authorities to verify the integrity of software.
So if Windows sees the Realtek signature,
It trusts it. If a driver is signed by a trusted entity like Realtek, the operating system kernel accepts it as legitimate, benign code. By stealing and utilizing these specific private keys, the attackers ensured their rootkit could load its drivers directly into Ring 0.
which is the highest privilege level of the operating system.
Exactly. Completely silently. The user receives no security prompt. The antivirus software, seeing a valid signature from a trusted hardware vendor, just waves it right through.
Which means obtaining those keys likely required either a highly sophisticated network intrusion into the corporate networks of J-Micron and Realtek in Taiwan, or actual physical espionage to extract the keys from their secure facilities.
Both are incredibly difficult to pull off.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the architecture of Stuxnet, once it successfully installs itself, reveals a hyper-specific mission profile. It is not designed to destroy everything it touches.
No, it's very picky.
The source breaks the malware down into 3 distinct modules. There's a worm designed for broad execution and environmental checking, a link file responsible for propagating copies of the worm, and a highly advanced rootkit whose sole purpose is to obscure all malicious files and running processes from both human operators and diagnostic tools.
This modular design highlights the fundamental tactical challenge the attackers faced breaching an air-gapped network.
The air gap.
Right. Industrial control systems managing critical infrastructure, particularly those involved in sensitive national security projects, are not connected to the public internet. They are physically isolated.
Meaning you can't just hack them from a laptop in another country.
Exactly. The initial infection must therefore occur on internet-connected networks, and the code must wait patiently for a human vector to bridge the gap.
It relies on SneakerNet.
SneakerNet, yeah.
An engineer infects their personal laptop or a general-purpose workstation. The worm moves onto a USB drive. That engineer eventually physically walks into the secure air-gap facility and plugs that USB drive into an engineering terminal connected to the industrial control network.
And just like that, the air gap is breached.
But what is remarkable is the sheer volume of collateral infections it generated versus the actual damage it inflicted. The worm was highly prolific in its spread. It jumped across local area networks and removable media, yet it remained entirely benign on the vast majority of infected machines.
That benign behavior was a deeply engineered constraint to maintain operational security. If the worm caused system crashes or degraded performance on every computer it touched, it would have been immediately flagged by IT administrators worldwide.
It would have been analyzed and neutralized before it ever reached its intended target.
Right, so to mitigate this risk, the developers implemented strict internal governors. The code was hard-coded with a self-destruct date. It was programmed to erase itself entirely on June 24th, 2000.
Literal expiration date.
Yeah. Furthermore, a single infected machine was restricted from infecting more than 3 other machines. It was designed to slowly, methodically saturate an environment without triggering volumetric alarms.
And while it was sitting on thousands of random machines, it was constantly running an environmental checklist. It was acting as an incredibly precise targeting funnel.
A funnel is a great way to describe it.
It didn't execute its destructive payload unless a very specific set of conditions was met. Let's trace the logic of this targeting funnel, as detailed in the source, because it really demonstrates the profound intelligence gathering that preceded the code's development.
It's layer upon layer.
First, the worm checks the underlying operating system. It requires a Windows environment.
Okay.
If that check passes, it moves to the second layer. It scans the system for the presence of Siemens Step 7 software.
Now, the requirement for Siemens Step 7 software is the first real indicator that Stuxnet is hunting for industrial infrastructure. Step 7 is a widely used engineering software suite designed to program and monitor programmable logic controllers, or PLCs. The PLC is the critical hardware component in an industrial setting. It is the embedded computer that takes digital logic from the Step 7 software and translates it into physical actions.
Like opening valves, regulating temperatures, or adjusting motor speeds.
Exactly.
So if the machine does not have Siemens Step 7 installed, the worm essentially goes back to sleep.
It just waits.
But if it finds the software, it initiates a man-in-the-middle attack on the local machine. It intercepts the communication protocol, specifically the Profibus connection between the Step 7 software running on Windows and the actual Siemens S7 PLCs connected to the network.
By intercepting this communication, the malware gains the ability to interrogate the attached industrial hardware. Which brings us to the third layer of the targeting funnel.
Right.
The malware interrogates the PLC to determine the exact make and model of the variable frequency drives attached to the system.
And variable frequency drives are essential for controlling the rotational speed of electric motors by varying the frequency and voltage supplied to them. Industrial facilities use thousands of these drives for pumps, conveyors, fans.
But Stuxnet was not interested in standard industrial drives.
Not at all.
The code explicitly queried the PLCs looking for frequency converter drives manufactured by only two specific companies, Vaken, which is based in Finland, and Ferropaya, based in Iran.
So specific.
Very. If the drives on the network were manufactured by Siemens or ABB or literally any other vendor, the malware aborted its payload.
Even if it found the Vaken or Ferropaya drives, it still wasn't ready to strike. It moved to the final, most restrictive layer of the funnel. It began passively monitoring the operational frequencies that those specific drives were outputting to the attached motors.
Just watching and waiting.
Right. It was programmed to only unleash its destructive payload if it observed the motors operating at exceptionally high speeds. Specifically, sustained frequencies between 807 Hz and 10,210 Hz.
That frequency range is the definitive operational signature of the target. Standard industrial motors, whether in a water treatment plant or an automotive assembly line, they just do not operate at continuous frequencies between 807 and 1210 Hz.
That's too fast.
Way too fast. Those extreme speeds are specifically required by gas centrifuges used in the isotopic separation of nuclear material.
Wow.
The rotors inside these centrifuges must spin at supersonic speeds to effectively separate the heavier uranium-238 isotopes from the lighter uranium-235 isotopes.
So the attackers knew the exact hardware vendors supplying the target facility, and they knew the exact operational parameters of the centrifuges.
The intelligence they had was flawless.
When all of those exact criteria were met, Windows OS, Siemens Step 7, Siemens S7 PLCs, Vaken or Ferropaya drives, and sustained frequencies above 807 Hz, the digital weapon finally executed its physical payload.
The trigger is pulled.
It ceased being a passive observer and took active control of the frequency converters. The source details the physical mechanics of the sabotage, which is just crazy. The malware would periodically override the PLC logic and force the centrifuges to spin wildly out of control, pushing the operational frequency up to 13,410 Hz.
This extreme overspeed condition subjected the delicate aluminum centrifuge rotors to massive mechanical stress. The physics of gas centrifuges are incredibly unforgiving.
They operate in a vacuum, right?
Yes, spinning on magnetic bearings at speeds close to the absolute material limits of the metals involved. When Stuxnet pushed the frequency to 1410 Hz, it likely drove the rotors through specific resonant frequencies. Those are the critical speeds where the natural vibration of the machine amplifies.
Which is bad.
Very bad. Passing through these resonant frequencies without careful control causes catastrophic wobble. But the malware didn't just overspeed the machines. After pushing them to 1410 Hz, it would aggressively slam on the brakes, drastically reducing the frequency to just 2 Hz.
The sudden deceleration from supersonic speeds down to a near halt, followed by a ramp-up back to normal operational speeds, induced catastrophic torque and vibrational stress. The aluminum tubes literally tore themselves apart.
Just shattered.
It destroyed the structural integrity of the cascades and contaminated the vacuum environment with processed gas and debris. But the brilliance and the terror of the attack lies in the rootkit functionality we discussed earlier. As the machinery was physically destroying itself, the operators sitting in the control room were completely unaware.
Right, because the man-in-the-middle capability of the rootkit was deployed to execute a devastating psychological operation against the plant engineers.
A psychological op.
Yes. Prior to initiating the destructive frequency changes, Stuxnet would record roughly 21 seconds of normal, stable operational telemetry from the PLCs.
Like a bank heist movie looping the security camera feed.
Exactly like that. Once the attack commenced, the rootkit intercepted the actual failing sensor data coming from the dying centrifuges and fed the pre-recorded loop of normal telemetry back to the Siemens Step 7 monitoring software.
So the monitoring screens in the control room showed everything operating perfectly within parameters, green lights across the board. The operators had no digital indication that the cascades were failing until they physically heard the machine shattering or the mechanical safeguards hard-tripped the power.
This forces a terrifying cognitive dissonance.
I can't even imagine.
You are an engineer in a highly secured facility. Your screens, which you are trained to trust implicitly, tell you the system is stable. Yet the extremely expensive, delicate machinery you are responsible for is failing at an unprecedented rate.
Before anyone suspected a highly advanced cyber weapon, the engineers likely spent months questioning their own competence.
Suspecting flawed manufacturing in the centrifuge parts or blaming operator error, it was designed to create chaos and organizational paralysis.
So what does this all mean? We have an unimaginably sophisticated digital weapon armed with 4 zero-days, stolen certificates, and deep industrial logic, engineered specifically to hunt down and physically shatter gas centrifuges operating at very specific frequencies. The source provides the crucial geographical context for this.
Yes.
In August 2010, the security firm Symantec published a geographical heat map of the global infection vectors. The data revealed a stark reality. Approximately 50% of all infected hosts globally were concentrated entirely within Iran. The target was the Natanz nuclear facility.
Now, before we go further, we need to pause for a second here.
We do, because the sources discuss some heavily politically charged geopolitical conflicts, specifically regarding the United States, Israel, and Iran.
Right, and we need to make it incredibly clear to you listening that we take no sides here. We don't endorse any actions by any country.
Exactly. We are strictly reporting the claims, the forensic footprint, and the historical consensus exactly as they are meticulously documented in the provided Wikipedia text. We are just analyzing the evolution of the technology and the documented global response.
Operating strictly within that framework, we must analyze the resource requirements necessary to develop a weapon of this caliber. Cybersecurity experts and intelligence analysts widely concluded that a project of this magnitude could not be the work of a non-state actor.
It couldn't be a couple of hackers in a basement.
No. Symantec estimated that developing the code would have required a dedicated multidisciplinary team of 5 to 30 highly skilled software engineers, vulnerability researchers, and industrial control experts working for a minimum of 6 months.
Not to mention they would need a physical mock-up of the Natanz centrifuge cascades to actually test the payload.
Right, which effectively demands state-level resources and vast intelligence-gathering capabilities.
The media investigations and expert consensus detailed in the source heavily point toward a collaborative effort. Major publications, most notably detailed reporting by the New York Times, classify Stuxnet as a joint U.S.-Israeli cyber weapon. The reports allege that the malware was developed under a highly classified, expansive intelligence initiative codenamed Operation Olympic Games.
The source notes that this aggressive cyber campaign was reportedly initiated during the administration of President George W. Bush and was subsequently accelerated and expanded under President Barack Obama.
And the specific intelligence agencies frequently identified by analysts in the text reflect the dual nature of the weapon.
The United States National Security Agency, the NSA, alongside the CIA, are cited as providing the vast software engineering resources, the zero-day exploits, the overarching architectural framework.
Right.
Meanwhile, Israeli intelligence, specifically Unit 8200, the elite cyber warfare and signal intelligence division of the Israel Defense Forces, is cited as providing the hyper-specific operational intelligence regarding the Natanz facility.
Because they needed to know the exact setup.
Exactly. The theory posits that Israel provided the exact hardware manifests, the network topologies, and the precise rotational frequencies required to calibrate the attack, potentially even testing the payload against physical centrifuges at their own nuclear facility in Dimona.
The source also highlights moments where this covert operation seemed to breach the surface of public awareness. A notable anecdote involved a retirement video created for the head of the Israel Defense Forces, Chief of Staff Gabi Ashkenazi.
The Daily Telegraph reported on this.
Yeah, they reported that during a celebration of his operational tenure, a showreel was played that allegedly included direct references to the success of the Stuxnet operation, heavily implying institutional pride in the deployment of the weapon.
But the code itself also provided researchers with a series of cryptic breadcrumbs embedded directly in the binaries.
Forensic analysis of the decompiled code revealed several embedded strings and dates that immediately sparked intense speculation regarding attribution. The presence of these internal markers highlights the complex psychological layer of malware analysis.
The most heavily scrutinized artifact was the presence of the word Myrtus embedded in the project file paths within the code.
Myrtus, which triggered immediate, wide-ranging geopolitical analysis. Some researchers argue that myrtus, the Latin botanical name for the myrtle tree, was a clear cryptographic signature.
Because in Hebrew, the word for myrtle is Hadassah, which is the birth name of the biblical Queen Esther of Persia.
Right, and given the biblical narrative of Queen Esther saving the Jewish people from a Persian plot, many analysts viewed the Martius string as a poetic, almost arrogant signature left by Israeli intelligence.
However, as the source notes, industrial control experts offered a much more grounded, technical explanation.
Yeah, the engineers looked at it differently.
Very differently. In the context of SCADA systems, MIRTUS could easily be interpreted as an acronym for my RTUs, meaning my remote terminal units, which is a standard hardware designation in industrial programming.
It could just be a boring file name. There was also a specific numerical value hard-coded into the execution logic, reverbal 19790509. Analysts immediately correlated this to a specific historical date, May 9, 1979.
This was the date that Habib El-Ghanian, a prominent Jewish businessman, was executed in Tehran following the Iranian Revolution.
While these clues heavily suggest an Israeli origin, analysts must approach them with extreme skepticism. In the realm of advanced persistent threats, attribution is notoriously difficult.
Experts from Symantec explicitly caution in the source text that attackers of this sophistication routinely employ false flags. Leaving a trail of culturally specific breadcrumbs pointing directly at Israel or the U.S. could be a deliberate counterintelligence strategy.
Designed to mislead forensic analysts and manipulate the geopolitical narrative.
Exactly. When you have the capability to write a half megabyte of undetectable weaponized code, typing the word MYRTUS to confuse your adversaries is a trivial effort.
It's too easy. Yet despite the untraceable nature of the 0 days and the deeply obfuscated code, deploying the weapon into a completely isolated network ultimately required human intervention. The digital weapon relied on traditional human intelligence, to bridge the final physical gap.
The sneaker net.
Right. The source brings up the role of a Dutch engineer named Erik van Sabben. According to intelligence reports, van Sabben was allegedly recruited by Dutch intelligence, working in coordination with the U.S. and Israel, to infiltrate the Natanz facility.
The reporting suggests that he utilized his engineering background to bring the infected equipment, potentially a contaminated water pump, or simply the infected USB drives directly into the plant.
The inclusion of van Sabben grounds the abstract nature of cyber warfare in stark human reality. The source notes the tragic and highly suspicious circumstances following the operation. Just 2 weeks after the Stuxnet payload was successfully deployed and the centrifuges began failing, Erik van Sabben died in an apparent single-vehicle motorcycle accident in Dubai.
Whether his death was a tragic coincidence or the result of counter-espionage operations remains heavily debated, but it certainly underscores the immense physical risks involved in deploying these digital assets.
But despite the vast intelligence apparatus, the careful physical infiltration, and the incredibly restrictive targeting funnel designed to keep the worm hidden inside Natanz, the weapon eventually escaped.
It did.
And the catalyst for the world discovering Stuxnet was not a brilliant counterhack by Iranian defenders. It was a simple, mundane programming error.
The architecture of the worm was designed to ensure it remained localized to the intended target and eventually deleted itself. However, the source indicates that an update to the worm's code introduced a minor configuration error.
A bug.
Just a bug. This error altered the propagation logic just enough to allow the malware to spread beyond the air-gapped environment. An engineer working within the Natanz facility connected their laptop to the infected industrial control network.
The worm, operating as designed, replicated onto the laptop.
Right. The failure occurred when that engineer subsequently removed the laptop from the secure facility and connected it to the public internet. Because of the programming error, the worm did not recognize it was outside the target environment.
So it failed to remain dormant.
It aggressively reached out, utilizing its zero-day exploits to spread from the engineer's home network across the global internet.
That single moment of reverse infiltration from the air-gapped facility back out to the public internet ignited the global cybersecurity response. Once the code hit the wild, antivirus firms worldwide began capturing the binaries.
Symantec's global telemetry map didn't just highlight Iran anymore. The heat map showed significant infection clusters in Indonesia, India, and Azerbaijan.
The aggressive propagation of the LNK exploit meant it was blindly jumping across massive corporate and municipal networks. The source notes a particularly alarming claim by Eugene Kaspersky, who stated that the worm successfully breached the networks of a nuclear power plant in Russia.
The infection of the Russian nuclear plant demonstrates the inherent volatility of self-propagating cyber weapons.
You can't control it once it's out.
While the Russian facility was heavily isolated from the public internet, preventing the worm from receiving external commands or spreading further, its presence inside another nation's nuclear infrastructure highlights the terrifying potential for unintended escalation.
The targeting funnel prevented Stuxnet from destroying the Russian plant because the specific Siemens hardware and centrifuge frequencies were absent. But the breach itself proved that the weapon was capable of violating the sovereignty of unintended targets.
The public revelation of Stuxnet and its capabilities had immediate cascading consequences across the geopolitical landscape. It functioned as a massive wake-up call, effectively kickstarting a global cyber arms race.
Iran, realizing the extreme vulnerability of their critical infrastructure, rapidly reorganized and heavily funded their national cyber warfare capabilities. They shifted from a relatively defensive posture to highly aggressive, retaliatory operations.
The source documents several major suspected Iranian cyber responses. In 2012 and 2013, they allegedly launched Operation Ababil. This was a massive, sustained, distributed denial-of-service campaign targeting the external networks of major United States financial institutions, causing massive disruptions.
But the retaliation extended far beyond DDoS attacks. The escalation reached a critical point with the 2012 deployment of the Shamoon malware against Saudi Aramco.
The Saudi Arabian National Petroleum and Natural Gas Company.
Right. Shamoon was a destructive wiper malware. It didn't attempt to quietly manipulate industrial controllers. It was designed for brute force destruction of data.
It successfully wiped the hard drives of approximately 30,000 corporate computers at Saudi Aramco, replacing the data with an image of a burning American flag.
The source also notes a highly destructive attack in 2014 against the Las Vegas Sands Corporation. Stuxnet essentially signaled to the world that critical infrastructure and major corporate entities were now legitimate, active battlegrounds.
And the original architects of the code were reportedly attempting to replicate their success elsewhere.
A Reuters report cited in the text indicates that the NSA attempted to deploy a modified version of Stuxnet to sabotage the nuclear weapons program of North Korea. However, that parallel operation ultimately failed.
It didn't fail due to a flaw in the code's logic, but rather due to the operational environment.
North Korea's extreme isolationism.
Exactly. Their rigorously air-gapped networks and the near-total lack of standard sneakernet crossovers meant the intelligence agency simply could not find a human vector to physically introduce the malware into the facility.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the forensic analysis of Stuxnet over the subsequent years revealed that it was not an isolated weapon. It was rather one component of a massive, heavily resourced cyber espionage ecosystem.
Security researchers mapping the architecture of advanced persistent threats eventually identified a cooperative umbrella of malware platforms. They refer to this as the G-Girl framework,
which linked several highly sophisticated threat actors, most notably the Equation Group, which is widely believed to be tied to the NSA.
The source notes that within this framework, researchers discovered several distinct malware families, including Flame, Duca, and Flower Shop.
And these share deep architectural similarities, zero-day exploits, and code libraries with Stuxnet. They were essentially sharing an open-source framework for nation-state cyber warfare.
Duqual, for example, is described as Stuxnet's cousin. It utilized a nearly identical modular architecture and rootkit design, but instead of carrying a destructive payload targeting centrifuges, Duqual was engineered purely for deep network reconnaissance.
It logged keystrokes, captured system configurations, and exfiltrated architectural data, likely laying the groundwork and mapping the networks for future Stuxnet-style physical attacks.
And Flame, an incredibly massive and complex espionage toolkit, directly shared USB propagation modules with early variants of the Stuxnet worm.
The discovery of this shared ecosystem proved that the intelligence agencies had developed a highly industrialized pipeline for cyber warfare. But the programming error that allowed Stuxnet to escape Natanz ultimately dismantled the exclusivity of that pipeline.
Once the binary was in the wild, the world's most capable reverse engineers, both in commercial security firms and rival intelligence agencies, decompiled the code.
They took it apart.
They analyzed the 0 days, they studied the man-in-the-middle rootkit techniques, and they mapped the industrial control subversion methods. The source code, the operational blueprint for the weapon, was eventually published online.
And that reality defines the true, lasting legacy of the operation. The source quotes Michael Hayden, the former director of both the CIA and the NSA. When assessing the impact of deploying Stuxnet, he stated, "They opened the box, they demonstrated the capability. It's not something that can be put back."
The fundamental architecture of Stuxnet is not inherently limited to Iranian gas centrifuges. The logic framework, the ability to remain totally hidden from the Windows kernel, the capacity to hijack local industrial communication protocols, and the capability to feed fabricated telemetry to human operators is entirely modular.
The blueprint is highly adaptable.
Extremely adaptable. With modifications to the targeting funnel and the specific PLC payload, the exact same architectural concepts could be deployed to manipulate the variable frequency drives on a municipal water pump.
Or alter the safety thresholds in a petrochemical refinery.
Or disrupt the robotic assembly lines in an automotive plant. The attack proved unequivocally that you do not require a kinetic weapon or a physical saboteur to inflict catastrophic damage on an adversary's critical infrastructure. You only require access and the right sequence of compiled code.
It is a sobering realization regarding the fragility of the systems we depend on. To trace the massive scope of what we've unpacked today, we started with the discovery of an unusually large half-megabyte binary spreading indiscriminately via USB drives. We analyzed how it deployed an unheard-of 4 zero-day vulnerabilities and stole cryptographic certificates to bypass perimeter defenses and remain entirely invisible to the operating system.
We walked through the incredibly precise targeting funnel, designed to cross the air gap and hunt down specific models of variable frequency drives spinning between 807 and 1210 Hz.
We explored the devastating physical execution, forcing the centrifuges at NATENs to tear themselves apart, while the rootkit fed perfectly normal data to the blinded plant engineers. We navigated the complex geopolitical attribution, linking the code to the U.S. and Israel under Operation Olympic Games, the mysterious embedded clues, and the tragic intersection with human intelligence.
Finally, we examined the fallout, the programming error that unleashed the code onto the global internet, sparking a retaliatory cyber arms race from Iran and exposing the highly modular framework of nation-state malware to the entire world.
The history of Stuxnet takes the highly abstract concepts of digital security and zero-day exploit markets and grounds them in terrifying physical reality. It demonstrates that the screens we look at are no longer barriers. They are highly vulnerable conduits to the physical world. The concept of securing a facility now requires defending against invisible logic just as rigorously as defending the physical perimeter.
This raises an important question, and it is reality I encourage you, the listener, to critically analyze as we conclude our deep dive today.
What's that?
Well, we have comprehensively detailed how a targeted digital weapon from 2010 possessed the capability to successfully infiltrate, subvert, and physically destroy machinery inside a highly secured, heavily monitored, air-gapped nuclear facility.
Right.
Considering the vast advancements in artificial intelligence, automated vulnerability discovery, and the proliferation of nation-state tools over the last decade, what highly obfuscated, perfectly dormant code might be sitting silently right now inside the critical infrastructure that you rely on? The municipal power grids, the local water purification plants, or the regional hospital networks that keep you alive and safe every single day.
That is a profound and genuinely unsettling thought to leave on. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We love unpacking these complex systemic topics with you and exploring the mechanisms that shape our modern world. Keep questioning the systems around you, keep learning, and we will catch you on the next one. Take care. Welcome back to the deep dive. We're doing something a little bit different today. Usually we take this really wide-angle lens to a topic, a war, a massive movement, some huge technological shift. But today we are zooming way, way in.
Right, zooming into literally just a single word.
Yeah, a single word, 2 characters to be exact.
Yeah.
Which sounds really small when you put it that way.
It does sound small, but the stack of research we're going through today suggests that these two characters are, well, they're anything but small.
No kidding. I mean, we're talking about a linguistic fossil here, something that unlocks a history spanning over 3,000 years. It connects Bronze Age star movements to ancient political coups and eventually lands us right in the middle of a massive theological war between the Pope in Rome and the Emperor in Beijing.
It really is wild. It's a term that feels incredibly ancient, almost mythical, and yet it's a word that millions of people use today, like this very morning, in their private prayers. And that word is Shangdi.
Shangdi, which roughly translates to highest deity or Lord above.
Right. Exactly. Highest deity. And the reason we are diving into this today isn't just to give you a linguistics lesson. It's because the story of Shangdi is really the story of how humanity's relationship with power has evolved, both divine power and political power.
I think what really drew me to this topic in the source material is that when you usually think of mythology or ancient religion, you think of these static stories. You know, Zeus is always on his mountain, Thor always has his hammer.
Right, the characters are locked in.
Exactly. But the story of Shangdi is this story of intense evolution. It feels more like a detective story, or honestly, almost like a corporate takeover than a religious text.
A corporate takeover is the perfect way to frame it. We are going to see how this tribal protector god became a moral force for the entire universe, and then basically a celestial map, and finally the center of this massive debate in the Christian world about how we even define the word God.
So just to keep us on track here, because this research really does go everywhere, let's set a quick roadmap for you. We are going to start way back in the Shang dynasty, 2nd millennium BC. We have to figure out who Shangdi was when he first showed up on the scene.
And from there, we'll move into what we can call the Great Merger. This is when the Zhou dynasty takes over and pulls off, frankly, one of the greatest rebranding campaigns in human history just to justify their rule.
I love that part. And then, and this is a section I'm really curious to unpack, we're going to look at the stars. We've got some fascinating research from David Pankinier and J.C. Didier connecting this deity to the actual physical layout of the cosmos and the North Pole.
Which is mind-blowing. And finally, we'll fast forward to the 1600s. The Jesuits, the missionaries, all trying to figure out how to translate the Bible into Chinese and why this specific word caused such a massive headache for the Vatican.
It's a lot of ground. But let's just jump right in at the very beginning. Who or what is Shangdi? Let's start with the name itself. Break that down for us.
So linguistically, it's quite potent. The first character, Shang, it means high, highest, first, or primordial. It implies this strict vertical hierarchy. It's all about being above everything else.
Okay.
And the second character, Dai, translates to Lord or deity. So you put it together, you get highest deity or Lord on high.
Now, I noticed in the notes that Dai is the exact same character used in Huangdi, which means emperor, like Qin Shi Huang, the guy who unified China and built the Terracotta Army.
That's true, but we really have to be careful with the timeline there. The usage of Dai for human emperors came much, much later.
Really?
Yeah. Originally, back in the Shang dynasty, Dai referred specifically to the manifest god. It was a purely divine title, not a human one. When the human emperors eventually took that title centuries later, they were essentially borrowing the gravity of that ancient divine name.
Okay, so it's like a king calling himself a god king. You're just co-opting that supernatural authority to boost your own poll numbers, basically.
Exactly. They were calling themselves the sons of heaven, explicitly linking their political authority back to this original day. But if we go back to the Bronze Age, to the Shang era, which is roughly 1600 to 1046 BC, Shangdi was not a human. He was the boss.
The boss. Okay, so let's look at his job description. It's the Bronze Age, life is fragile, civilization is just clinging to the banks of the Yellow River. What was Shangdi actually responsible for day to day?
Everything that mattered. In the Shang dynasty, Shangdi was the ultimate spiritual power. But we need to clear up a major misconception right now. He was not necessarily this benevolent, warm and fuzzy grandfather figure sitting on a cloud. He was an absolute powerhouse.
Right.
He controlled victory in battle. If your tribe lost a war against a neighboring group, it wasn't just because of bad military strategy. It was because Shangdi specifically willed you to lose.
So he's essentially a war god.
A war god, yes, but also an agricultural god. He determined the success of the harvest, and obviously, in an early agricultural society, that is literally a matter of life or death.
Yeah, if the crops fail, the entire dynasty fails.
Precisely. And he controlled the weather. Specifically, The floods of the Yellow River. Now, you have to remember, the Yellow River is historically known as China's sorrow.
Because it floods so unpredictably.
Right. If it floods just the right amount, you get this beautiful, fertile silt and amazing crops. If it floods too much, it completely wipes out your capital city. And Shangdi had his hand firmly on that tap.
Wow. So he really is the CEO of the universe. He's managing the profit and loss of the entire kingdom.
In a way, yes. And like any powerful CEO, he had a whole hierarchy underneath him. Shangdi ruled over a vast court of nature gods, spirits of the wind, the clouds, the rain, and crucially, he ruled over the spirits of the deceased.
Okay, but here's the part that I found really striking in the source material, and I want to drill down on this for a second. The sources explicitly say that Shangdi was considered too distant to be worshipped directly, which feels completely counterintuitive to me. If he's the big boss, and I really need it to rain, don't I want to talk directly to him?
You might want to, but in Shang theology, you simply couldn't. He was way too transcendent. He was too powerful. The gap between a mortal, even a living king, and Shangdi was just vastly too wide. Think about it like an unpaid intern trying to just casually walk into the CEO's top floor office to ask for a fundamental change in corporate strategy. You just don't do that.
Right, you get fired immediately. Or in this case, smited.
Exactly, smited. So you need middle management.
You need lobbyists.
You need lobbyists. And the middle management in the Shang religious system was the royal ancestors.
Ah, the ancestors. So this is where the famous Chinese concept of ancestor worship really comes into play.
Right here. The Shang kings would pray to their ancestors, their grandfathers, the legendary kings of the past. And those ancestors, because they were now spirits dwelling in the divine realm, actually had access to the court of Shangdi. They could approach the throne.
Got it. So they would basically put in a good word for you.
Yes, they would entreat Shangdi on behalf of the living king.
It's literally a bureaucracy of the dead.
It really is. It's a deeply transactional, bureaucratic system. You offer sacrifices to your deceased grandfather, you treat his memory well, and you just hope he uses his political capital with the big boss to get you that rain you need.
And what's amazing is that we know this not just from some vague stories passed down through the generations, but from hard physical evidence. The oracle bones.
Yes, the oracle bones. This is honestly one of the most significant archaeological finds in human history, found mostly in the ruins of Yingsu, which was the last capital of the Shang dynasty.
I really want you to describe this process for us, because I think people hear the phrase oracle bones, and it sounds very mystical, like throwing some chicken bones in a dusty bowl.
Yeah.
But the actual mechanics of it, according to the sources, were highly technical, almost industrial.
Oh, it was incredibly technical. They practiced a specific type of divination called scapulomancy. They would take the shoulder blades of oxen, or sometimes they used the plastrons, which are the flat bottom shells of turtles. And they wouldn't just toss them in a fire. They would carefully clean them, scrape them down until they were a very uniform thickness, and then polish them.
So this is serious prep work. This isn't impromptu.
But very serious prep work. It took a lot of time. Then the diviners would drill these highly organized rows of hollows, or little pits, into the back of the bone. Not drilling all the way through, mind you, just deep enough to leave a very thin, fragile layer of bone on the front side.
And then comes the heat.
Right. During the actual ritual, they would take a glowing hot metal rod or a burning hardwood brand and apply it directly into those pre-drilled hollows.
And the heat makes it crack.
Exactly. The rapid, intense expansion of the material would cause the bone to fracture on the smooth front side. And the shape of that crack, the exact angle, the length, whether it branched off, that was read by the royal diviner as the literal voice of the ancestor, or the will of Shangdi himself.
And the sound of it, too. I read in the notes that the sound of the crack was actually really important.
Yes. The old Chinese word for divination in this specific context is bu. And it's actually an onomatopoeia. It's meant to mimic the exact sound of that bone cracking under the heat, like a sharp pop or a poo sound.
That is just fascinating. So the king isn't just making a wild guess or having a dream. He's basically running a diagnostic test on the universe.
And the questions they were asking weren't just personal trivia. These were matters of state. Will it rain this week? Will we win this upcoming battle against the King tribe? Is the millet harvest going to fail?
High stakes.
Incredibly high stakes. And the inscriptions they carved onto these bones after the ritual, they record the date, the diviner's name, the exact question asked, and very often they recorded the final result of what actually happened later.
It's a government archive.
It is the literal minutes of the royal meeting with the divine. And what becomes crystal clear from reading these records is that Shangdi is sitting at the very top of the pyramid. He is the ultimate one who sends down the mandate. But he is scary.
Scary.
Well, he sends down disasters, plagues, enemy raids. He is not a god you love in the modern sense. He is a god you deeply fear and respect. He represents absolute, unyielding authority.
Okay, so Shangdi is this distant, powerful, frankly terrifying figure at the top of the cosmic org chart. But then we hit this massive turning point in Chinese history. The Shang dynasty falls. The Zhou dynasty takes over. And this isn't just a simple change in management. It's a full-on clash of cultures.
It is. The transition from the Shang to the Zhou is absolutely pivotal. We're talking about the year 1046 BC, specifically the Battle of Muye. The Zhou were people from the western frontiers, and they completely conquered the Shang. Now, usually when you conquer a people in the ancient world, you destroy their gods.
Right, that's standard operating procedure. My god beat your god, so your god is fake. Bow down to ours.
Exactly. But the Duke of Zhou, who is the brother of the first Zhou king and essentially the chief architect of this brand new dynasty, he did something so much smarter. He realized that the Shang people, who were very numerous and culturally sophisticated, had been worshipping Shangdi for centuries.
You can't just wipe that out overnight without causing a massive rebellion.
You really can't. It builds too much resentment. So instead of destroying the god, you need a merger. You need to essentially acquire their theological intellectual property.
Okay, so how do they pull that off? Because the Zhou had their own god.
They did.
Yeah.
The Zhou people had their own concept of the supreme cosmic power, which they called Tian, which is usually translated into English as heaven. But Tian wasn't quite a personified, distinct entity like Shangdi was. It was a bit more abstract, more like a cosmic force or the sky itself.
So now you have these two supreme deities floating around. The Shang people have Shangdi, and the new Zhou rulers have heaven. How do they resolve that?
They conflated them. They aggressively promoted the idea that Shangdi and heaven were, in fact, the exact same thing. They effectively went to the Kang people and said, hey, you know that High Lord you've been worshiping this whole time? We worship him too. We just happen to call him heaven.
That is just brilliant political rebranding. It instantly unifies the religious base. It lets them say, look, we aren't foreign invaders overturning your world. We serve the exact same boss you do.
It was brilliant. But they didn't just merge the names, they added a crucial new twist to the theology. And this is the concept that ends up defining Chinese political history for the next 3,000 years, the mandate of heaven.
Okay, let's really unpack this one, because I think a lot of people hear mandate of heaven, and they instantly equate it to the divine right of kings, like what we saw in Europe. But it's actually quite different, isn't it?
It is fundamentally different. In Europe, the divine right of kings generally meant that the king was God's appointed representative on earth, period. So you couldn't overthrow him no matter how terrible he was, because he answered only to God. But the mandate of heaven is strictly conditional.
Conditional, like there's a performance contract.
Yes, exactly like a contract. Remember, under the Shang, Shangdi was basically a tribal protector. He looked out for the Shang people because they were his specific bloodline. It was cosmic nepotism. The Zhou completely changed that dynamic. They rebranded Shangdi, or heaven, as a universal moral force.
Oh, I see. So he stops playing favorites based on family ties and starts judging the ruler based on their actual behavior.
Exactly. The argument the Zhou made to the conquered people was this. The Shang kings didn't lose the throne because they were militarily weak. They lost the throne because they were wicked.
The propaganda writes itself.
It does. They claimed the last Shang kings were drunkards, they were cruel, they tortured people. Basically, they lost their virtue. And Shangdi, being a purely moral force, withdrew his mandate to rule from the Shang and handed it over to the Zhou. Why? Because the Zhou were virtuous.
That is the ultimate airtight justification for a violent coup. We didn't steal your kingdom. God gave it to us because you were terrible employees.
It legitimizes the usurpation completely. But, and this is the genius part, it also puts a massive burden on the new rulers themselves.
Because the rules apply to them now, too.
Right. If you claim that you have the right to rule simply because you are virtuous, then you actually have to be virtuous. Because if you start acting corrupt, heaven can absolutely take the mandate away from you and give it to the next rebel army.
It creates a built-in system of accountability. a cosmic checks and balances system.
Exactly. And to really cement this new reality, the Zhou court actually adopted a lot of the old Shang religious practices. They even kept members of the Shang aristocracy alive and housed them in a special ceremonial city just so they could continue to maintain the ancient sacrifices.
Wow, they really wanted to make it look seamless.
They wanted to make it look like D was native to them, too, and it worked. By the Western Zhou period, you look at the bronze inscriptions and you see the terms Di and Tian being used completely synonymously and interchangeably.
So deity became less of a tribal father figure and much more of an abstract, universal moral standard. But that original connection to the High Lord up in the sky still remained.
Yes, it did. And this brings us to what I think is the most visual, tangible part of our investigation today. We've talked about the politics, we've talked about the theology, now I want to talk about astronomy.
Yes. This is the section covering the research from David Pankinier and J.C. Didier. And this is where the detective work gets really incredible to me. Because the claim they make here is that Shangdi wasn't just an abstract idea or a political tool, he was something you could actually physically look up and see.
This is genuinely one of the most fascinating theories in the entire field of archaeoastronomy. Pankinier and others have spent years looking at the absolute obsession the early Shang and Xia cultures had with the night sky. Their palaces, their tombs, their temples, everything was painstakingly aligned to the stars.
And specifically, aligned to the North Pole. But, and this is a really important technical point we need to clarify for you listening, it's not the North Star we have today, right?
Correct. We live on a planet that wobbles on its axis. Due to a phenomenon called the precession of the equinoxes, the Earth's axis actually points at different stars over a massive cycle of about 26,000 years.
Right, so today our axis points right at Polaris. That's our North Star.
But back in the Shang era, around 1600 BC, Polaris wasn't in that position. In fact, there wasn't a bright star exactly at the pole at all.
So what was there? If you looked exactly north, what did you see?
A void. What Pankinier refers to as a vacant apex.
A vacant apex? That just sounds ominous.
It does. It's a specific spot in the night sky that appears completely empty. It's darker than the rest of the sky. But if you watch the sky throughout the night, all the other stars rotate perfectly around this dark, empty center. It is the literal pivot of the universe, the one unmoving center.
That sounds incredibly theological just describing it. It's like the unmoved mover, the calm eye of the cosmic hurricane.
Exactly. And the theory here is that Shangdi was explicitly identified with this true celestial pole. He is the center of the cosmos. He is the invisible central force that makes the entire universe spin around him. He doesn't have to move, but everything else is forced to move around him.
And there's actual visual evidence for this in the writing system itself, right? In the ancient characters.
Yes. If you look closely at the ancient Shang script for the word Dai, the exact character they etched onto those cracking oracle bones we talked about earlier, it doesn't look like a person. It looks kind of like a scaffold, or maybe a stick figure with a prominent crossbar. Sometimes it even has these little lines or rays radiating out of it.
It looks like a structural framework.
What Pankinier did is show how you can take that ancient character and literally project it onto a map of the stars, exactly as they appeared at the North Pole during the Shang era.
And it fits.
It fits perfectly. The shape of the character aligns with the surrounding stars, specifically the handle of the Big Dipper and some of the other major circumpolar stars. And the exact intersecting center of the character crosses right at that dark, vacant pole.
That is just wild. So when a Shang diviner wrote down the word God, they were quite literally drawing a star map of the center of the sky.
That is the compelling argument. And it suddenly makes total sense of his title. Lord above, highest deity. He isn't just socially high. He is physically located at the highest, most central point of the heavens. It grounds the entire theology in physical, astronomical observation.
And there's also this deep analysis by J.C. Didier about the square shape often found in the character. Remember reading about this idea of the celestial square in the source text?
Yes, Didier's work takes this another step. The character for Day often implies a square shape, or a sense of boxing something in. Didier argues that this represents the celestial square formed by the specific stars rotating around the pole. But crucially, it also perfectly mirrors the layout of the royal ancestral temple back down on Earth.
As above, so below. The physical temple on Earth is just a mirror reflection of the stars in the sky.
Precisely. And what was kept inside that square temple on Earth? The ancestral spirits. So this brings us right back to the idea of the ancestors. Didier suggests that Dia might not have even been conceived of as just one single guy.
Wait, really? Not a single deity?
Right. Because the square housed all the main lineage ancestors, DDA posits that Dai could have been a collective force, the sum total of all the great ancestors who had ascended and basically merged with that celestial pole.
So God is essentially a hive mind of spiritual power. Just all the great ancestors living together in the center of the sky, turning the universe.
Potentially, yes. And it perfectly explains why the Shang Kings felt they had to pray to their ancestors to reach Dai. The ancestors weren't just lobbyists, they were actually a part of Dai. They had merged with the pole.
That completely blows my mind. It totally changes the perspective from, a giant man sitting in a chair in the clouds to this massive, churning cosmic mechanism.
And the sources even mention a fascinating distinction found in some of the older inscriptions between a Shangdi, meaning high Dai, and a Xiadi, meaning low Dai.
High God and low God. What's the difference there?
It seems to differentiate between friendly spirits and hostile spirits. The high Dai might represent the benevolent royal ancestors who are aligned with the central pole and bring order, while the low Dai might be a category housing foreign gods or chaotic nature spirits that bring floods and disasters.
It just reflects such a complex, layered view of the supernatural world. It's not just a monolith, it's an entire working system.
It is a mechanism, a cosmic mechanism made of stars, ancestors, and raw power. And for thousands of years, this system kept evolving. It merged with Confucian thought, it merged with Taoism, and it became the absolute bedrock of Chinese state religion.
Which makes what happens next in our story even more surprising. Because we're going to jump forward a few thousand years now. The Shang dynasty is long gone. The Zhou dynasty is gone. We are now in the late Ming and early Qing dynasties. It's the 1600s. And suddenly, here come the Jesuits.
Enter Matteo Ricci.
Matteo Ricci, who was a fascinating guy in his own right.
Very much so. Ricci and his fellow Jesuit missionaries arrive in China with a very clear, very singular mission: convert the vast Chinese populace to Catholic Christianity. But they immediately run face first into a massive linguistic hurdle.
Right. How do you translate the word God?
Exactly. It seems so simple to us, but it is fraught with extreme danger. In the West, the Christian concept of God is highly specific. He is omnipotent, he is the creator of the universe from nothing, he is personal, and he is entirely distinct from his creation.
But in China, you arrive and they have the emperor, they have the ancestors, they have the Buddha, they have the Tao, they have heaven. Which of those words do you pick?
And if you pick the wrong word, you accidentally tell millions of people to worship a ghost or a mountain. Or worse, from the church's perspective, a demon.
So what does Ricci do?
Well, Ricci was a scholar, so he starts reading through the ancient Chinese classics. He's literally reading the exact same stuff we were just talking about, the ancient texts from the Zhou and Shang eras.
He's doing the archaeolinguistic detective work.
He is. And he finds Shangdi. He sees this ancient, revered term for a supreme moral authority, the Lord of Heaven, the one who judges virtue, the one who famously punished the Shang dynasty for being wicked. And Ricci thinks, bingo, we found him.
It does seem like a perfect fit, honestly. It links the Christian God to the most ancient, most respectable Chinese tradition available. It allows Ricci to walk in and say, hey, I'm not bringing you some strange new foreign god from Europe. I'm actually bringing you back to your own original God, the one you used to worship perfectly.
That was exactly Ricci's strategy. It's a theological approach called accommodationism. He wanted to show that the ancient Chinese were essentially early monotheists who had just kind of lost their way over the centuries as Buddhism and Taoism got mixed in. Now, he initially used the term Tianzu, which means Lord of Heaven, but he strongly shifted toward promoting Shangdi specifically to appeal to the elite Confucian scholars. He wanted to sound intellectual. He wanted to show he deeply respected their classical culture.
But looking at the history, this did not go smoothly at all. This wasn't just a clever linguistic choice. It turned into an absolute war.
Oh, it sparked what is famously known as the Chinese rights controversy. And calling it a controversy is putting it incredibly mildly. This was a full-blown diplomatic and theological disaster.
So who exactly was fighting who here?
Well, on one side you had the Jesuits, and they're saying, look, Shangdi is God. We can use this word. We can respect these ancient traditions. We can let them keep honoring their ancestors. It's fine. It's a cultural bridge.
Okay. And the other side?
On the other side, you had other Catholic orders who arrived in China a bit later, primarily the Dominicans and the Franciscans. And they were much less, well, let's say they were less flexible.
They were the theological hardliners.
Very much so. They looked at the word Shangdi and they said, absolutely not. No way.
What was their specific objection, though? Was it just a petty turf war between different orders of monks?
It was definitely partly a turf war over influence, yes, but there was a very real, very deep theological disagreement at the core of it. The Dominicans argued that Shangdi, in the Chinese classics, is a governor. He orders the world. He manages the mechanisms of the universe.
Okay, but isn't that what the Christian God does too?
Yes, but in classical Chinese thought, the cosmos itself kind of exists eternally. Shangdi brings order to it, but he didn't necessarily create it ex nihilo. He didn't create it from absolutely nothing, which is a core tenet of the God of Genesis.
Ah, okay. That is a subtle but absolutely massive distinction. One is a cosmic manager organizing things. The other is the supreme architect who built the room from scratch.
Exactly. And the Dominicans were terrified that by using the name Shangdi, the new Chinese converts would just keep doing their traditional pagan ancestor worship and just mistakenly think it was the exact same thing as Catholicism. They thought Ricci was dangerously diluting the core theology. They straight up called it idolatry.
Wow. So they took the fight all the way up at the chain of command. They took it to the Supreme Court, the Vatican?
Yeah, they did. And it gets even crazier because the emperor of China at the time, the Kangxi emperor, who was a brilliant ruler, he actually weighed in on the debate.
The Chinese emperor got involved in a Catholic theology dispute.
Yes. He actually sided with the Jesuits. He wrote a declaration saying, look, these ancestor rituals are civil traditions. They aren't religious worship in the way you fear. We honor Shangdi as the highest authority of the universe. It's totally fine. You guys are overreacting.
But I'm guessing the Pope didn't really care what the Emperor of China thought about Catholic theology.
Not even a little bit. Pope Clement XI issued a definitive edict in 1715. He effectively said, stop using Shangdi right now. He strictly banned Catholics from using the term and forced them to universally adopt Tianzu, Lord of Heaven. And he also strictly banned any Chinese Christians from participating in any traditional ancestor worship rites.
Man, that must have gone over terribly with Emperor Kangxi.
It was a disaster. It ended up getting Christian missions functionally banned in China for a very long time. The emperor was profoundly insulted. He essentially said, how dare a foreign pope sitting in Italy tell my subjects how to speak their own language and honor their own families? If you can't respect our culture, get out.
So if you go to a Catholic mass in China today, centuries later, they still say Tianzu.
Mostly, yes. The Catholic Church stuck with Tianzu. But the story of Shangdi doesn't end there, because much later in the 19th century, the Protestant missionaries show up.
The British and American missionaries.
Right, and guess what? They run into the exact same translation problem, and they have the exact same massive debate all over again. It became known as the term question.
Did they reach a different conclusion?
They split on it. Some Protestant missionaries absolutely loved the word Shangdi. They loved it because it linked perfectly to this idea found in the Bible of the unknown God, this theological idea that God leaves a witness of himself in every human culture.
Oh, so they could say, the God you've been worshiping in ancient times, the one who ruled the stars, but you didn't fully know him, that's Yahweh. That's the God of the Bible.
Precisely. It was a very powerful evangelical message. Now, other Protestant missionaries fiercely preferred the word Shen.
Shen. What does that mean?
Shen is a much more generic Chinese word for a god or a spirit. It doesn't carry all that specific ancient imperial baggage that Shangdi does. But despite the pushback, Shangdi really stuck for many Protestants. They liked the sheer majesty of it. They liked that ancient High Lord authority it commanded.
So today, in the modern world, if I walk into a Chinese Protestant church in Beijing or Shanghai, and I open up a Standard Union Version Bible, what word am I going to see?
You will very likely see Shangdi used as the primary translation for God. And it's not just in the church. In modern secular Chinese media, too, when they translate a movie or an article referring to the God of the Abrahamic religions, they very often use Shangdi.
That is just an incredible irony. The Pope totally bans the word, causes a massive diplomatic incident, but it survives and thrives over in the Protestant tradition.
It really is a historical anomaly. It is one of the very rare examples in history of a distinct, ancient pagan deity's name being successfully co-opted and normalized for a monotheistic religion. Usually, when a new religion comes in, the old names are demonized. You know, Baal becomes a literal demon in Christian lore. Zeus is relegated to just being a myth.
Right, the old gods get demoted.
But here, the name was adopted, elevated, and essentially sanctified.
You know, before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something you briefly mentioned in our roadmap at the start. The Temple of Heaven in Beijing.
Yeah.
Because this is where the physical worship of Shangdi actually took place by the emperors right up until the early 20th century, right?
Yes, if you ever visit Beijing, you absolutely have to go. The Temple of Heaven complex is an architectural marvel, and it was built specifically, exclusively for the emperor to personally perform the annual sacrifices to Shangdi, or heaven.
And what did that ritual actually look like in the later dynasties?
Yeah.
Because we started this whole conversation with the bloody cracking ox bones of the Bronze Age.
Yeah.
Did the ritual completely change?
It became much more refined, much more visually spectacular, but the core theological elements were shockingly similar. And frankly, they were shockingly similar to the rituals described in the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
This grand ceremony happened every year on the winter solstice.
The shortest day of the year.
Right. The emperor, after fasting and purifying himself, would go out to this magnificent round mound open-air altar. And a healthy bull, specifically a young calf entirely without blemish, would be slaughtered and burned as a whole, burnt offering to Shangdi.
A completely unblemished calf burned on an altar. That sounds exactly like the book of Leviticus.
The parallels are striking. The smoke rising up into the open sky to please the heavens. But here is the single most important detail about the Temple of Heaven, and it's the detail that those early missionaries really latched onto. Inside that vast temple complex, there were absolutely no idols.
Wait, no statues at all? No golden calves? No paintings of an old man with a white beard sitting on a cloud?
Nothing. In the Imperial Vault of Heaven, which is the most sacred building there was no statue of a god to bow to. There was only a spirit tablet. Just a simple vertical wooden plank, beautifully carved, sitting on a throne, and inscribed on that wooden plank was just the name, Huangqian Shangdi, Supreme Lord of the Great Heaven.
Just the name. Nothing else.
Just the name. And this visually reinforces that core idea of Shangdi as being completely abstract, completely transcendent, and entirely formless. He wasn't some guy you could carve into a piece of stone or cast in bronze. He was the ultimate invisible force beyond all form.
That really brings us full circle to that distant quality we talked about in the very beginning. He is so high up, so far beyond human comprehension, you can't even picture him. You just write his name on a piece of wood.
It does. And honestly, that brings us to the deep irony of how the word is used today. And I think this is really the ultimate takeaway of our entire episode.
Yeah, let's look at the big picture here, because the journey is wild. We started with a god who was basically the tough, uncompromising boss of the Shang dynasty, a tribal war god who controlled the river floods and demanded cracked turtle shells to answer questions.
Then he evolved. He became the universal moral judge of the Zhou dynasty, the absolute source of political legitimacy who could and would fire the emperor if he got too corrupt.
Then we looked at the stars and saw him as the literal pivot point of the night sky, the vacant apex of the universe, the dark mechanism that physically turns the heavens.
And finally, through this crazy twist of translation, cultural negotiation, and missionary zeal, he became the accepted name for the Christian God for millions of people.
And that leads perfectly into the final provocative thought I want to leave everyone listening with today. Think about this. The ancient Shang kings genuinely believed that Shangdi was far too distant, far too powerful to ever be worshipped by regular people. He was completely inaccessible.
Right, you needed a royal bloodline, or a deceased ancestor, or a burning bone just to get a basic message to his outer court. He was the CEO you could never, ever meet.
Yet today, right now, millions of Chinese Christians use that exact same ancient name, Shangdi, in highly personal, entirely private prayer. They whisper that name in their bedrooms. They cry out to it in moments of deep personal crisis.
It's incredible.
The name that was once the literal definition of unapproachable power has somehow become the name of the most personal, intimate, spiritual connection a believer can possibly have.
It's a fascinating linguistic and spiritual journey. From the cold, distant center of the North Star to the quiet intimacy of personal faith. It really shows that words are just containers.
Containers?
Yeah. They hold history, they hold intense political struggles, they hold maps of the stars, but the actual meaning poured inside them, that is always flowing, always changing with the people who use them.
Well, on that note, we're going to wrap up today's deep dive. Whether you're looking up at the stars tonight or just reading a history book, keep an eye out for those hidden connections. You really never know where tracking a single word might take you. Thanks for listening.
Always a pleasure to explore the depths with you. Until next time.